Thanks everyone, welcome, especially colleagues from the profession and my students past and present. I'm delighted to be able to address this topic, and it's great that Han has been able to make space for this subject. I'm really keen to thank Han for the opportunities that Han is the Human Animal Research Network, the opportunities it has presented me, because as you know, I come from the Faculty of Veterinary Science, but just on occasions one feels that the focus on animal welfare could be stronger within the faculty. So Han has allowed me to leave the silo, as it's called, and work with people like Fiona and Chris. So good on Han, and what an amazing conference. You should be so proud of yourself, Fiona. Well done. So thanks to the faculty for giving me the opportunities to conduct this research. I should say that I've received no funding for this research, so there's nobody pulling my strings. I'm going to show you data from a series of 6 studies that I've conducted over the last couple of years. And the photographs that you'll see are largely the work of a valued colleague in Victoria called Liz Ralston, so thanks to Liz. These are some of my research colleagues. These are the horses I live with in the Hunter Valley. Some of them are owned by members of the audience now. So I've got the opportunity to see horses at very close hand a lot of my day. I'm very fortunate to spend time looking at horses in family groups. This is a view from my office window. So you can see what a smug bastard I am. This is just some of the quite amazing photographs I'm able to take. If you're clicking long enough, you get lucky, and so you get these quite amazing shots. And these horses teach me a lot. They teach me a lot about what horses value and what they need and how they behave. So I'm very grateful to them and for the opportunity to study them. I do spend a lot of time training horses, and I make no apology for that. I'm fascinated by the way that they learn. And I'm going to show you a couple of new ideas around horse training and animal training in general. I'm also going to be showing you some very fresh data that were released today to do with the use of the whip in racing. You get to know these horses when they're babies, and it's a really valuable opportunity for me to ensure that they're not fearful of me, because that's the first time that these horses have been sat on. It's opened my eyes to what a crude expression breaking in actually is, because these horses are actually getting the biggest scratches and tickles of the day, but they happen to have a monkey on the back. So that takes away a lot of the fear that is part of early training. So we refer to foundation training rather than breaking in these days. And you're right, I should be wearing a hat. I should be wearing a hat, yes. I am interested in how little pressure we need to use when we're riding horses. So this is a horse I spent a lot of time with, and I didn't need to use a bit when I was riding him, because we could use just very gentle pressure on the noseband. And it's the removal of pressure that's incredibly important in training horses. I've published a book for veterinarians and equine scientists. It's called Equine Behaviour. It's now in its 2nd edition. In the 13th chapter of this book, I was able to co-write with a fellow called Andrew McLean, Dr. Andrew McLean, a chapter on training. And that gave way to a whole new science, equitation science. And Andrew and I have been founding presidents of that society. It now has over 200 members. And its essence is to take the guesswork out of horse training, because we believe that confused riders are creating conflict in horses. So the more we can strip out confusion in riders, the better chances the horse has of delivering what is being asked of it. That is not to say that there's not an art to horse riding at all. It's trying to take the guesswork out of the mechanisms that get the best responses. And underpinning that, most people in equitation science would agree that we have to acknowledge the importance of what's called operant conditioning. Operant means the animal is operating in the environment. Conditioning is learning. So it's the learning how to operate within the environment. And essentially all training requires us to think about what responses we want and what responses we don't want. We want to make some responses probable and others unlikely. And in our toolkit, we've got the opportunity to use aversive stimuli or attractive stimuli. And these 4 quadrants are often referred to as the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning. So giving an animal an attractive outcome and making a response more probable is positive reinforcement. Taking something away to increase the likelihood of a behaviour is called negative reinforcement. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means arithmetically you're removing something that then strengthens the behaviour. And the best of practitioners in negative reinforcement are going to be using some very small pressures, very small amounts of aversive stimuli, because if you use too much, the horse, for instance, or in any animal training situation, but in the case of horses, they will certainly habituate very quickly, and then you're going down this spiral of using more and more force, which is the last thing you want. So the best practitioners are mindful of how little pressure they need and how quickly they must remove the pressure once the animal has responded. If you forget that and just keep using plenty of aversive stimuli, the animal will start to sort of stop responding, and that is what we worry about most, is learned helplessness, where the animal just shuts down and becomes apathetic. Another term for this is learned hopelessness, which is a term that my former professor John Webster uses. So that's the ugly side of using aversive stimuli, but those pressures in horse training are pretty much ubiquitous, and we want to be able to congratulate people who use the least amount of pressure. Now, I wanted to show you a new way of thinking about these 4 quadrants. What we've done, and this is work that I've developed over the last few years, and it's now come to fruition in a conceptual form through the work of one of my wonderful PhD students. This is the work of Melissa Starling. It's available online at an open access journal. I'm just going to switch monitors because I can show you these images in 3D. What we've done here, I don't know how to get rid of the bubbles, I'm afraid. Just wiggle your mouse. Thank you, Chloe. That was fun, wasn't it? What we're doing here is we're saying, of course, those 4 quadrants are a simplification. We're saying here that the probability of a behaviour emerging depends on at least 2 other things. It depends on the animal's level of arousal, which we're giving an arbitrary scale from 0 to 10 here. And it also it's affected by the animal's affective state, which again, we've given an arbitrary scaling from 0 to 10. So the arousal is fairly obvious. It's how awake the animal is. And the affective state is a term we use to describe how the animal's feeling, in a good mood or a bad mood. That's the shorthand. So here we've got a conceptual schema that describes how those 4 quadrants can interact as landscapes dependent on the animal's affective state and level of arousal. And so the first landscape that I'm showing here is negative punishment. So that's where you're taking something away to make the behaviour, to train the behaviour. So you might, in child rearing, you might say no lollies because you've been evil. So it's a good job I'm not a parent, isn't it? So that's an example. You can see how low the probability is of you being able to train a horse to walk forward on its back by taking lollies away. Let's look at the prospect of positive punishment. to get the animal to walk forward, so that every time it stops, you actually punish it. It's slightly more effective, but it's still not probable in all cases. A probability of 1 is saying that it would emerge, the behaviour would emerge. Let's then build another landscape and add positive reinforcement, where every time the animal walks forward, we might deliver a food reward. And we've actually developed a bit that delivers molasses water with a trigger to develop this type of training. So you can see that in almost all instances, we're getting a better effect with positive reinforcement. Punishment is effective in some animals, dependent on their affective state and arousal state. These are conceptual graphs. I must confirm that or remind you of that. We hope to populate these with data very shortly. Finally, we had the fourth quadrant, which is negative reinforcement. And you can see that the probabilities of achieving a behaviour of this walking forward response under saddle has increased. And that's why we generally trigger horses to walk forward by gentle pressure, and the moment they move forward, we remove the pressure. So that's just a little taster of an acknowledgement that operant conditioning is complex. So I just wanted to make that point. I'm going to switch back to the other presentation now. This is the landscape that I've just shown you. This is a landscape where the target behaviour is actually getting the horse to put its nose on a piece of card, a target. So the approach you would take would be different. The easiest way to train a horse to target, as it's known, is to use positive reinforcement. And that's what we're seeing here. So there's just a reminder that we're aware of the complexity and that different tasks attract different sorts of training. Given that horses are so often ridden with the application of pressure and trained with the application of pressure, there is room for concern about excessive pressure. And so I know there are some people in the audience who would rather eat their own vomit than ride a horse because they feel that it's oppressive to ride horses. I appreciate that, but I would argue that there is an ethical way of approaching horse use and horse riding, and that's what we've dubbed ethical equitation. I've got a couple of papers out on that topic, and I'd encourage you to track them down. Please contact me if you're interested. One of them is with Andrew McLean, my greatly valued colleague, and another is with Bidder Jones from RSPCA Australia. And here we're arguing that you can actually apply a cost-benefit approach to horse training. You can actually identify the insults to the animal's welfare, mitigate them, and then your job as the rider is to justify the residual. That's a cost-benefit approach that we use in ethical frameworks such as that ethics committees. So that's the idea here, is that every insult has to be mitigated, and then if it's the residual has to be justifiable. And I'm going to posit that the benefits of whipping horses compared to the cost horses pay doesn't stack up. That's what I have come to believe myself, and I'm going to share with you data that I believe support that view. So these are some of my students and some of my horses, and that's just an acknowledgement that we do use whips. We use them with great care and with great dexterity, we believe. So these are, you can think of these as an extension of your arm. You're just basically using them to tickle the horse's flank. The moment the horse responds, you stop that irritant. And they should be used with great care. I've got a hat on there. See how happy I am wearing my hat? This is one of my foals, the very lovely Sierra. She is reminding us how easily horses feel pressure. So horses can feel a fly landing on them. Just because they're big doesn't mean they're hippo-hided. These animals have got great innervation in their skin. So that their skin can actually move. There's a thing called a paniculus reflex that you see when a fly lands on a horse, that the whole skin can shake. So yes, they have got strong skin, but it is highly innervated. The focus on horse welfare is fascinating for me because that's where the animal welfare movement started. It was the beating of tired horses in Victorian England, in Victorian London, that meant that Richard Martin started agitating, and eventually there emerged the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So it's fascinating to me that the horse has been an ambassador for other species. The question is whether it's benefited as much as other species. So just remind yourself that this is important because these are animals that couldn't respond. They were too tired. They were hauling loads up hills and being flogged, and the middle classes, the emergent middle classes, said that they'd had enough. Whether they just didn't like the bad language that was accompanying the abuse of these horses is another matter. But the important thing here is that tired horses were being beaten in the name of work. The background on the whip is that it certainly has been a traditional feature of thoroughbred racing, and welfare concerns have been expressed quite widely in the large racing countries. In Norway, they've had whip-free racing for 30 years, and I'm going to show you a letter from the CEO of the Thoroughbred Racing Authority in Norway, because it makes some interesting points. The industry's response here has been to introduce a padded whip. The industry, in the UK's industry, the British Horse Racing Authority, has dubbed this the pain-free whip. And there are also some restrictions on the number of times that whips can be used. That's an old whip. That's a regular whip. This is a padded whip. And I will hand this round. Be gentle with each other. Before I do that, I just wanted to highlight one industry response to the padded whip. Gay Waterhouse said that she felt that her jockeys, Blake Shin and Cathy O'Hara, that was her junior jockey and her female jockey, really need to work on their fitness and become stronger riders. With the new padded whip rules coming out, jockeys will have to use all their strength and aggression with their body, as they will not be able to hit their horses as many times. So she was concerned that the horses were going to get a free ride. And that is an interesting proposition, that horses are somehow deceiving riders and storing some energy just to catch them out. We don't have any evidence that horses have that cognitive power to deceive. Another response from an industry commentator, Patrick Smith, in reference to whip use, this is from 2011, he was saying, how can we call ourselves civilized? He's positing that whipping horses is the most televised form of violence to animals. These are the padded whips that come in various lengths, and what I wanted to do was show you the important part of this whip for me is the binding that holds the padding on, because that in itself cannot be padded. The moment a horse is struck by that, it's being struck by a knot. And there is one study that has exposed that concern by colleagues in the UK. So here's the whip. Please hand it round. Thanks, Chris. This is the letter from Norway that gives you a bit of background. The Norwegian Ministry of Agriculture issued in 1982 a new law against cruelty to animals. It was decided that in trotting and thoroughbred racing, use of the whip was forbidden. We did not have any increase in jockey injuries after the introduction of these rules. Furthermore, the work of acting stewards was made a lot easier. We have hardly any interferences in the races, and according to trainers, racing is easier on a lot of the horses without use of the whip. Interference in the races is quite interesting because if you look closely enough, you can see jockeys hitting each other, interfering in that sense with each other, and sometimes whipping other horses on the face. That's what that refers to. The reason it's easier for stewards is because they don't have to count the number of whip strikes. And so that's a potential benefit that can be easily overlooked. This is Hans Peter Eriksson, who's the author of this letter. He would also like to say that racing in Norway is rather small. Last year we had 13 meetings from middle of April till middle of December. And that is why the racing industry here dismisses the Norwegian experience. The former CEO of the Australian Racing Board, Andrew Harding, was on Late Line saying you might as well talk about Timbuktu. That was his response to the question about Norwegian racing. But if you do the numbers, you've got 38 meetings a year, let's say 6 races per meeting. Over 30 years, we've got a rich data set. If I was to try and set up that experiment, I'd be a long time getting those sorts of data. So I think we should look at the experience from Norway because it's clear that in every race, a horse wins. We don't obsess with race times. We obsess with the position in which they finish. These are the images from the study that I mentioned that looked at the problem of the binding. It involved people, there was a device that was made, a whipping arm, and this kept thwacking areas of plasticine to show the problem. That was in 1996, and there's been very little since then. Prior to that, in 1987, there was a study just of 4 quarter horses at the Gallop, because they race quarter horses in the States. Over a quarter of a mile as it happens. That's why they're called quarter horses. I don't know what happens when you cross a quarter horse with another horse, maybe get an 8th horse, it's not clear, but these animals slowed down when they were struck. They were being struck on the shoulder of the leading forelimb in rhythm with the stride, but the interesting finding was that stride length reduced and the stride frequency increased, but the horses certainly did not increase speed. So they changed their style, and that may give you a feeling that the horse is responding with acceleration. But that's all we had until our group started looking at the whole science of whip use. It's worth pointing out that the industry is under a lot of pressure because of online gambling. There are now animated races. If you go to the right pub or the wrong pub, you'll see this is a still from an animated race. So the strange thing is these horses are also whipped. But I'm beginning to accept that some of the arguments that for whip use are supported from a perspective of the racing as an industry and others as a sport. But when we're looking at an ethical framework, we consider it as a sport. The job of the stewards and the Australian Racing Board is to assure integrity of racing. They don't want jockeys manipulating races and throwing races, so you can be penalised for failing to ride a horse out on its merits. Certainly, this is a workplace, and it's appropriate that the safety of jockeys is considered and prioritised. The welfare of horses is said to be paramount, according to Andrew Harding. And the jockeys are under a lot of pressure to whip horses because the connections want to see those horses ridden to the max. And if you have a horse that responds extremely badly to whip use, you have to actually apply to the stewards so that it is not struck. because the punters want to see horses ridden out. So this isn't an exercise in bashing jockeys. My studies are sympathetic to the pressure they are under from their connections and so forth. Andrew Harding has assured the public that the Racing Board is committed to doing everything possible to protect the welfare of racehorses. These are the rules as they stand, and there's a reason I'm going to walk you through these, because there's a focus on forehand whip use. Forehand is when you carry the whip as if you were playing tennis. Backhand is as if you were holding a ski pole. So here we have the rules that prior to the 100-metre mark, the whip shall not be used in the forehand manner in consecutive strides, so the horse can show that it's responded. Because if it responds and gets whipped immediately, then you're actually punishing responding. The whip shall not be used in the forehand more than on 5 occasions prior to the 100-metre mark. So forehand versus backhand. You'll notice here that backhand is not limited. There's no limit on the number of backhand strikes. The rider may, at his discretion, use the whip with a slapping motion down the shoulder with the whip remaining on the reins, or alternatively in the backhand manner. So there's a bit of a message there. Other rules, that the rider will be penalised for hitting the horse forward of the shoulder with the arm above the shoulder. When the horse is out of contention, when the horse is showing no response, when the horse is past the post, when the rider is using the whip to cause injury, or when the horse is clearly winning or has no prospect of improving its position or losing its position. And that the seam of the whip should not be the point of contact. How that is policed, I have no idea, but it's there. And the seam rule is overlooked if the rider can satisfy the stewards that it was neither deliberate or reckless. Gov. So after the 100-metre mark, it's all on. That's when the horses are attracting most of the whip strikes. And the stewards police the rules using footage that's 25 frames per second. That's important for reasons I'll expose shortly. And so they count the number of whip strikes and look at the administration of the rules. These are my collaborators, and so that's Andrew, that's Bidder, that's a grinning idiot, and that's David Evans, who's an exercise physiologist. And we were fortunate enough to win the Voiceless Eureka Prize for our work on ethical equitation and the response that horses make to whip use. So I'm just going to look at that as the first study. The aims were to describe whip use and horse performance during thoroughbred races and investigate associations between racing performance and whip use. We looked at 5 races. This is with the cooperation of Racing New South Wales. The horses have monitors on their saddle cloth, so we were able to look at their progress between through different sections at the close of the race. That's why I used Canterbury. Fairly tight margin of distances that are all dry, firm tracks, and horses were excluded if they had poor performance or there were obvious breaches of the rules of racing. These are the results. The horses were not whipped in the section 3, which is from 600 to 400 metres from the end. Whipping started at the section 2, 400 to 200 metres, and then really cranked up in the final 200 metres, to the extent that that some horses were whipped 14 times over a period of only 12 seconds. So it's quite remarkable how quickly horses can be whipped. Certainly the horses ran the fastest when they weren't being whipped, so we can interpret some fatigue there, and there was a significant decrease in velocity that was accompanied by this average of 6.5 strikes, but we're not arguing cause and effect there. The placings of the horse, the position they were in at the 400-metre mark and the 200-metre mark, they significantly predicted the likelihood of placing. Velocity in the final 200 metres did not predict a placing. And whip strikes in the final 2 sections were also not associated with the outcome of the race. The industry responded by saying that it wanted to see a lot more of this sort of study. And I wrote to them twice asking for more data. But they don't return my calls these days. The next study looked at the same data because we really wanted to get as much information out as possible. We looked at the predictors of whip use, because there should be no predictors of whip use. But in fact, what we found was that horses drawn on the inside barrier, close to the barrier, were getting more whip strikes. And that was not what we expected, because we expect horses to travel a longer race further away from the rail and therefore need more of what the racing industry calls encouragement. In inexperienced jockeys, we're using the whip more than experienced jockeys. And that echoes this concern about the pressure that these jockeys are under, especially when they're junior. The third study asked whether handedness, left or right-handedness, was influencing the way the whip was being carried. And what we did here was we examined the claim that if the whip's being used for steering, then you'd want to be able to steer the horse using the whip, and you want to prevent horses colliding into each other or into fixed objects. We hypothesized that the whip would be of greatest benefit if it was used on the outside of the bends, and so the whip should be held in the outside hand. The fortunate thing for this study is that we could compare Victoria with New South Wales because they race in different directions. So we examined 200 horses racing in both states. In Victoria, we found that 91% of the jockeys were holding the whip in the right hand, the outside hand. So we expected that if there's a strong steering argument, that you get the same percentage or something similar. But we didn't. We found that 53.5% of jockeys were holding the whip in the right hand. So there's a significant difference in the use of the outside hand. The carriage of the whip appears to be primarily dependent on the handedness of the jockeys, because of course most people are right-handed, rather than the direction of the track, and that given that over half of the jockeys in New South Wales are holding the whip on the inside hand, this certainly challenged the view that the whip was being used for steering. The next study was to look at the area that was being struck and the visual impact of the whip at the level of the horse. This was of interest to me because Australia is a signatory to an international agreement on breeding, racing and wagering. And part of that international agreement is that whipping horses on the flank is prohibited. And so Australia's signed up for that. The flank is basically the side of the horse, the abdomen, not the thorax, but the abdomen. And it's believed that that is quite a ticklish area, but there's no science to say that it feels more pain, the horse feels more pain in that area. What we did was we were given opportunistic high-speed footage of 15 race finishes. And we looked at them frame by frame, looking at the start of each arm action. We started off with 350 wrist and arm actions on 40 horses viewed from the outside of the track. A lot of them were obscured by infrastructure and other horses, so we had to discard quite a few that we couldn't see their landing. That left us with a total of 104 non-contact sweeps, where the whip was just sweeping past the horse, and visual evidence of 134 actual strikes. And because whipping in front of the saddle is not limited, there are no rules about that, we just focused on whip strikes behind the saddle. So that left us with 109, the pool of observable strikes. And two of us working independently looked at the area that was struck, the percentage of unpadded section that made contact, whether there was a visible indentation on impact, whether the whip was used in a forehand or backhand manner, whether the jockey's arm was travelling over the shoulder height, and whether the seam made contact. And any time that we disagreed, we would exclude those strikes. So we only looked at whip strikes for which there was concordance. We found at least 28 examples in 9 horses of breaches, 1 seam contact, but you have to remember that we were looking at very high quality footage. 13 contacts with the head. I don't think that was deliberate. I think that was a jockey stowing the whip, and it was flapping on the horse's face. So stowing on the horse's neck, and it was flapping the horse's face. And there were 14 arm actions that rose above the height of the shoulder. Now this is interesting because when the RSPCA asked the stewards about this, the stewards did actually penalise one jockey in the light of this better footage. So here's an argument for better policing of the rules. If you're going to have rules, then you've got to be able to police them. And the industry conceded that they had benefited from high quality footage. Approximately 70% of the whip strikes were in the backhand manner. So these are not policed. The visible indentations, this one's actually disappeared into the skin, were evident on 83% of impacts. And the reason that's interesting is because when we presented our first paper in, we included a photograph of a horse with an indentation. And the journal said that's worst case scenario, you're exaggerating. This is evidence that it's more common than not. The flank was struck in 75% of impacts, so that contravenes the undertaking through the international agreement. The unpadded section made contact 64% of impacts, so that's a concern. So the padding is offering less protection than is claimed because the binding is making contact. Now, I'll just show you, well, I will show you this. This is a video that the RSPCA developed in the light of this research. This horse gets struck in the groin, unfortunately. I think the point there is that if you use the right technology, you can actually see what's going on, and the public don't. And so it's a reminder of how commonly we overlook this form of violence to animals. Very briefly, another study attempted to ask jockeys about their beliefs and opinions about whip use, but we approached over 1,000 jockeys. But it became very clear that they didn't want to respond. We actually had evidence that they had been told not to respond. But the Journal of Veterinary Behaviour, nevertheless, was interested in helping get some information out from this study. We had 24 responses. There was no disagreement with the suggestion that whip use is essential to get the best possible finishing position, but a third of our respondents also acknowledged that some horses move sideways dangerously in response to whip use. So reconciling those two views is something that we'd like to do with the cooperation of the Australian Jockey Association when they become interested in this topic. Thank you. We used pressure detection pads, and this is the new data, to examine the force of impact of 288 whip strikes. So we had 6 jockeys, and they were on they were sat on a racing simulator, and they were asked to deliver 12 strikes using the left hand in the forehand manner, left backhand, right forehand, right backhand. And so what we found was that to our surprise, the jockeys were actually striking with more force in the backhand. And that's data that were released today. These are the results. What's interesting for me is that these are your backhand, these are your forehand, these 6 jockeys. You can see that they're all over the place. So the industry can't really say a whip strike is a whip strike is a whip strike. They're so variable from one jockey to another that it's very difficult to assure punters that horses are being struck with a standard action. And the stats show that the backhand, when being used by the rider's dominant hand, these were all right-handed jockeys, was significantly landing with significantly more force. The force we're talking about is in this study was 46 newtons. If it helps at all, comparable studies in of mechanical pain thresholds in cattle and sheep tell us that levels of around about 4 to 6 newtons are considered noxious. So these are significant forces, and they again the speed with which they're striking was quite remarkable. That's why you don't see it, because jockeys are so expert at delivering strikes. This is from today's Australian. Patrick Smith has covered this story. Just to show you the last 3 paragraphs. Peter McGorran, who's the current CEO of the Australian Racing Board, said that an increase in backhand use of the whip was expected after the 2009 rule change, because it limited the amount of times jockeys could strike their mounts in a forehand manner. But he says a backhand whip strike is more a slap rather than the forceful forehand action, given the position of the jockey and the movement of the arm. I'd say that's not the case. Our data definitely refute that. Patrick Smith then says, as researchers get a better picture of the action of the whip on horses, surely it is getting harder for a civilized nation to allow the abuse to continue. What about the vets? Well, this is the current policy on whip use held by the AVA. They have accepted the emergent science, and they recently asked me to present to their Policy Advisory Council on the 5 other studies that I've just shown you. Just looking at the policy, we've got excess or incorrect use of a whip on any horse, including the whipping of horses unable to improve their position in a race field, is not condoned. Whips are used during horse racing to control or guide the horse and to make the horse perform more competitively. However, there is ongoing research questioning whether whip use will result in improving a horse's placing. But it then goes on to say, the whip functions as a training aid by being a tool for negative reinforcement, and hence the whip should be used to educate the horse when it responds incorrectly. Using whips to educate horses when they've responded incorrectly is actually punishment. So I've had to tell the RSPC, the AVA, that if they were my students, they'd be doing a resit. They then go on to say that they're particularly concerned about whipping of the hindquarters, areas other than the hindquarters and the shoulder, and that's important because they're trying to take a science-based approach, but there is no evidence that these areas are more or less innovated. That work is still to be done. One key word here is in the policy itself is that the horses unable to improve their position in the race are of a concern. I've suggested to the AVA that it would be very simple just to remove that word. Anyway, let's look at this. To summarise, we saw that there were these 3 big priorities for the industry: jockey safety, racing integrity, and horse welfare. The current approach from the data suggests that jockeys are maintaining safety. Their safety is not directly affected by whip use. The RSPCA has said that whips should be carried for safety reasons, but not for acceleration purposes or maintenance of speed. The ability to question, the ability to police the rules is certainly questionable because they don't have the equipment. You need very high quality cameras, and they need to be pointing at the horses from 3 directions to avoid that loss of data from obscuring And horse welfare is definitely questionable under this framework. If we had whipping-free racing, we'd maintain the status quo for jockey safety. I believe we'd be able to advance racing integrity and look to a future with ethical racing and a more sustainable future, and certainly horse welfare would be advanced. So we've moved from whipping tired horses in the workplace as a trigger for that whole animal welfare movement, but we still have tired horses being whipped in the name of sport. Just going to show you one more video. This guy here drops his whip. Can you see that? He's then in breach of the rules. You can't race if you drop the whip, unless, of course, you win. And he rides like a champ. He gets right off the gluteal mass. So this is the powerhouse of the horse, and he gets right up the horse's neck, and he's riding in a way that's called hands and heels. That jockeys, apprentice jockeys in the UK, have to ride without a whip to perfect this style. And he's giving the horse every mechanical chance to perform to its best. And lo and behold, this horse does indeed win. Bing, with its ears forward. They are such beautiful animals. So that was just a little example. I'm not saying that's a data set, but it's just an example of what I picked up while I was looking at those high-speed footage. So to conclude, I think we can safely say that the whip rules are not being and cannot be properly policed. The whip rules allow the harshest impacts to go unchecked, and they may have even prompted that, sadly. That wasn't the intention. The so-called padded whip does not safeguard the horse from pain, and whipping tired horses in the name of sport is increasingly difficult to justify. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.